Good evening and welcome everyone to the MHCH Housing Justice Educational Forum, Myths and Facts about Rent Control. Ryan Bell is with us this evening to talk about rent control and to get the facts straight. Not alternative facts, real facts. Facts that can stand up to scrutiny. Facts that can walk a straight line and pass the sobriety test. Because there are a lot of drunken facts out there. Facts that have been going a little too hard on the sauce and they're spouting all kinds of nonsense like this. So tonight we're going to rein them in and set the record straight. But before all that, I'm going to quickly give a report on the work of MHCH, and then we'll hear a housing story from Diowanni Tate. And then Ryan will present, we'll have Q&A, and Jill will wrap us up with an ED report. So I am going to share my screen here. This always takes a minute to do. And from the beginning. There we go. So what's happening at MHCH, or otherwise known as our team reports? So at Making Housing and Community Happen, we have a very small paid staff. We're all part-time, but we have more than 50 volunteers. Now, 2 of them are Jill and Anthony, who work full-time and overtime for free, but we have more than 50 volunteers, and many of them work on 4 different teams. So I'm going to talk about those teams. First, we have our safe parking team. There are about 15,000 people living in their vehicles in Los Angeles County, but until recently, there was no safe parking program in the San Gabriel Valley. But on April 1st, 2021, we helped start the first safe parking program in the San Gabriel Valley in partnership with Foothill Unity Center. That program has 5 safe places to park, access to a bathroom, case management services, and referrals to things like permanent housing. Right now, there are 4 current participants. 2 have been permanently housed. We have a couple of special situations I was asked to mention tonight. There's a woman who's a senior citizen, and due to technical reasons, she is low priority to receive a rental voucher. So with her age and health issues, it's a challenge to live in her car. So please pray for her and all the other parkers to get housed. Also, one person, an artist, needs his trucks fixed so he can join the program. A working vehicle with insurance is required, so funds are needed for him. So we do have special situations like that. The 2022 Pasadena count showed 13 people in Pasadena living in their cars and 10 people living in RVs. So we have this program here in Pasadena. We're also expanding to other San Gabriel Valley sites. If you want to volunteer in that on that team, contact Wendy McGrail. You can get her by email, wendybmcgrail@gmail.com. That's Wendy B, then McGrail is McGrail@gmail.com. That's if you want to volunteer on the team. If you want to make a referral, if you know somebody's living in their car and you want to make a referral to the safe parking program, contact Myra Bueno. That's Myra at foothillunitycenter.org, MAIRA at foothillunitycenter.org. I think I've got that right. Yeah, .org. Or 626-358-3486. Our congregational land team is next, and they consult with congregations to build affordable housing. They're now in discussions with at least 65 congregations throughout Southern California to have affordable housing built on their land. They completed their first educational cohort to educate congregations on what they need to do to prepare to have affordable housing on their land. And we're about to go into our second educational cohort starting next week. Now, what we often run into is that the zoning is not right for a lot of congregations. So we've been working on religious overlay zones within municipalities. We got one done in Sierra Madre, and then in Yorba Linda, and in Pasadena. In all of these, we've done these religious overlay zones that doesn't zone every congregation, but zones more congregations than were previously zoned so they can have affordable housing. We're also working with other cities in Southern California. We've gotten overlay zones into a lot of the housing elements. And now we are working with a state, at a state level, with a state coalition to get a religious overlay zone done across the state. So churches across the state can be zoned to have affordable housing. Next, our Affordable and Supportive Housing Advocates, or ASHA team. This is our general advocacy team, does most of its work here in Pasadena. And some of their recent victories are they won approval a few years ago of 69 units at Heritage Square South. That's the corner of Orange Grove and Fair Oaks. That's 69 units of permanent supportive housing for seniors experiencing homelessness. And it just broke ground this summer. After that, they won 111 units of senior affordable housing in the Civic Center right across from City Hall. 10% of it will be for seniors experiencing homelessness. It's permanent supportive housing. So we're still working on the housing element. We're in the larger coalition working on the housing element. The housing element is a plan that every city in California has to have to plan for the next 8 years of housing. It's a plan to make sure everybody is housed. But traditionally, cities have not taken, including Pasadena, have not taken this seriously. So in our coalition is trying to make Pasadena pass a meaningful housing element. Also, we're working on transitional housing. This is for people who have been experiencing homelessness. And this could take various forms, a tiny home village or a hotel, a conversion. But we're working on transitional housing to house people experiencing homelessness. And we have joined the rent control coalition, which Ryan is going to talk about. We also have our North Fair Oaks Empowerment Team. This is 10 African-American churches on North Fair Oaks who want to beautify and not gentrify that part of the city. They want to do it through signage, through more trees, sidewalk repairs, and affordable housing. Some of them want to have affordable housing on their land. They also want to do something called complete streets, which is to transform the streets into streets that are usable not just by cars, but by pedestrians, cyclists, and other modes of transportation. They've also started something called the 20 Percenters Group, which is in partnership with the Harambee Center. And that is for people who've been displaced from Pasadena who want to come back. The city passed an ordinance recently that said that 20% of new affordable housing is prioritized for people who've been displaced in the last 10 years. So this is a group of people who've been displaced, and they want to make sure that they get on those, they get that priority. Our community land trust team spun off into its own 501c3. It is incorporated as the San Gabriel Valley Community Land Trust, but we're still paying somebody to work with that team, even though it's its own nonprofit now. If you don't know what a community land trust is, a community land trust makes home ownership more affordable by letting people buy a house without having to buy the land, because the land is owned by a nonprofit, and that makes the housing, keeps the housing permanently affordable. The San Gabriel Valley Community Land Trust will be the first community land trust in the San Gabriel Valley. There are community land trusts all over the world. They began in the Deep South. African Americans started them in the Deep South. They spread all over the world, but there is none yet in the San Gabriel Valley. This will be the first. We also have a congregational network of more than 20 congregations that participate in MHCH. If you want your congregation to be in that network, then contact me, Bert Newton, by email, bert@makinghousinghappen.org, or call or text me 626-993-7958, 626-993-7958. And that it does it with the team reports. So do we have a question? Does Denise have a question?
Hi, yeah, just a quick question. So first of all, thank you for all of that. And thank you for all that you're doing. I appreciate you. And I wanted to ask about a community land trust. Is that the same thing as what Caltech and UC Irvine do for their professors? Because I know they have all these really nice homes that visiting professors or professors live in, and then they have to give them to the next professor. But I wondered if legally it was the same thing as the land
Let me
trust.
respond to that quickly, and then I'm going to introduce Diowanni.
Yeah, okay.
Great question, Denise. It's a very similar model. There's universities around the country, including Harvard, Westmont, Cal State, there's one, Cal Poly, San Luis, and including UCI. And so it's similar in that they are selling homes to professors, and then they don't sell the land, just the home. And then they're able to accrue equity, and then they're sold to another person that's typically on their faculty. So it's similar model, but this is a separate nonprofit and not a university. And the city of Irvine has one of the largest community land trust in Southern California. And they're doing a great job. They've now expanded it to all of Orange County. So let me introduce Diowanni. She's awesome. I'm so impressed with her. And I hope that we can make it so that we can do a spotlight. Okay, there we have my dear, amazing friend, Diowanni. And she has a history of helping. She's a great helper. She currently works with special needs populations and mental health, and her compassion and comedic timing offers an innovative way to challenge others to become the best version of themselves. And I have seen that in how she operates. It's a joy. And so thank you, Diowanni, for sharing your housing story with us.
Thank you, Jill. Hello, everyone. My name is Diowanni Tate, and I am a transplant from Jackson, Mississippi. Some of you may be familiar with Jackson because of its recent water crisis, which made and is still making national news. According to Michael Reagan, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Jackson's water system finally reached a breaking point after years of neglect this summer, leaving tens of thousands of people without any running water for weeks. My father, a Vietnam veteran, currently lives in Jackson along with other relatives and many friends. Please keep them in your prayers. On July 1st, a Friday morning at around 9 a.m., I received an eviction notice along with my fellow tenants. The anxiety associated with being told you have 60 days to vacate the premises without any regard of your next home, which was extremely stressful, and for some of us, it was traumatic. As a 4-year resident, I thought I had found my home sweet home here in Pasadena, partly because I didn't think I would experience some of the ugly issues my parents and grandparents faced during the civil rights era regarding housing. I was confident I had found my home sweet home. I was blessed to have experienced a supportive community with my neighbors and friends throughout Pasadena, especially during the early weeks of the pandemic, when uncertainty was at an all-time high. We had become neighbors taking care of neighbors by sharing toiletries and other household staples, which were missing from most stores across the nation. Y'all remember that, right? Of course you do. The beautiful thing about this camaraderie was no one ever asked to be compensated for the eggs, the meat, paper towels, or other essential goods that were shared. After receiving that 60-day rent eviction notice, I, along with my fellow tenants, were overwhelmed to say the least. We didn't know we had rights until after someone told me to connect with Jill Shook with Making Housing and Community Happen, who then turned around and introduced me to Ryan Bell and others with the Tenant Justice Coalition. These two groups gave us a ray of sunshine during what seemed to be dark and a hopeless period. Unfortunately, some tenants moved out, and those of us who stayed are currently experiencing the bangs, the dings, and the dongs of construction workers hammering away. According to USA Today, Black women in America are more likely to be evicted than any other group. Although these numbers are staggering, I am hopeful when I see the following famous Black women come from humble beginnings and change the game for many: Oprah Winfrey, Viola Davis, Mary J. Blige, Venus and Serena Williams, just to name a few. Friends, they didn't get where they are by themselves. They had supportive communities. In closing, tonight I am calling on my community, my church family, and my friends to help pass rent control, accompanied by just cause eviction. Once this is passed, I will be secure in my home. It is imperative that we not evict someone without just cause and exclude individuals from renting in our communities because of selfish greed, as this will largely impact people with Black and brown skin. Dear Pasadena, my home, sweet home, please support us by voting and encouraging others to pass rent control. And know that your vote really does matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Diowanni. That was beautiful.
Thank you, Diowanni, for sharing your story and for mentioning that list of powerful Black women who have changed the game for others and given hope. Next, we will have someone who is part of the Pasadena Tenants Coalition that Diowanni mentioned. Ryan Bell is the Southern California regional organizer with Tenants Together, a volunteer member organizer with the Pasadena Tenants Union. He is also a campaign organizer and finance coordinator for the Measure H campaign for rent control and just cause protections in Pasadena. So Ryan, take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate the warm welcome. It's great to be among friends and also meet some new folks here. Thanks for taking a few minutes out of your Tuesday evening to learn more about this. So what I've been asked to talk about, Jill and Anthony have asked me to talk about myths about rent control. So I didn't prepare a lot about the actual details of the measure, which we have talked about multiple times before, but there'll be Q&A, and I'm happy I basically wake up talking about it in my sleep, arguing with somebody on Nextdoor or something like that. So I'm getting pretty good at not getting stumped by questions. Though if I do encounter something I don't know, I'll just tell you I don't know, and then do some research and pass it along to Jill and Anthony, and they can invert and they can pass it along to you. So let me just share a quick, I want to share basically 7 myths that are common among, when we talk about rent control. Rent control is like a lot of things in the American and probably outside of America as well, political discourse, where there is a conventional wisdom that has become conventional wisdom over the last, I would say, 50 years. And people think they know a lot about rent control. And what I like to tell people is that rent control is not one thing. It's many different, there are many different versions of rent control. It's evolved, its implementation has evolved over time. Policies have been refined and honed, and they're constantly being changed and modified. So there is not one thing called rent control, though the idea of it is universal, which is that a community, whether a state or, a federal government could theoretically do this too, or a local government, places limits on how much landlords can raise the rent. Back in the earlier part of I guess the mid part of the 20th century, there were like basically rent freezes that went under the name rent control. So a lot of times when we encounter people, they think rent control means rent freeze. I guess I could have listed that as one of my myths. Rent control does not mean a rent freeze. It means that landlords are limited in how high they can raise the rent. It's at this point that I want to go off on a tangent and talk about like political philosophy and about why housing is not a commodity like every other kind of, like when you go to the grocery store and you buy strawberries, and then you go next month to the store and buy strawberries and they're $2 a pound more, and there are market pressures that make that the case. Likewise there are market pressures in the housing world, but they don't work quite like strawberries. It's not quite as simple. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the details, but we will have time to talk about it at the end. So what are some common myths about rent control. And I thought maybe we could start just by, in fact, let me stop sharing my screen for a moment so we can see each other. What are either a myth that you've heard, or maybe you're not sure if it's a myth. Maybe it's a criticism of rent control that you're wondering, is that a myth or is that true? Does anybody want to offer something? I'll let Jill call on the hands, or maybe Bert wants to do that. Linda, I guess.
Denise, do you still have your hand up? No.
Oh, no, that's a new one.
Okay.
I was going to say the one that I hear the most is it's going to bankrupt me as a landlord.
Okay. I don't even have that one in my slides, but I'm writing it down. We can address it a little bit. It won't take take about 10 seconds. Linda, you had your hand up.
I think that was Linda.
That was Denise, I think. Or was that Linda?
Okay.
Sonia, go ahead.
I've heard it doesn't work. That studies have shown it doesn't work, but they never explained anything beyond that.
Okay. That's a
There's
really
one
good
in the
one.
chat. There's one in the chat also.
Oh yeah, landlords will take units off the market. That's a good one. Thanks for putting that there. You're hitting on some I don't have in my slides, so this will be good. We can add these time permitting and cover as many as we can. Well, let me go ahead and get started because we don't want to run out of time. Now, where did my presentation go? Hold on one second. Oh, I know. It's over here. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Found it. Okay, so let's get into this. Very often we hear when we talk about rent control, the real need is for more housing supply. And this is not exactly a myth entirely. It's a partial truth. The fact is we do need more housing supply, but there are some indicators, there's some research that shows that we actually have enough housing in many places, or at least enough potential housing if we did some adaptive reuse. What we lack is housing that's affordable for people at every strata of the income spectrum, especially those at the bottom. So usually when people say the need is for more housing supply, what they mean is not rent control, but more supply. And that if we have supply in a very sort of rudimentary economics 101 sort of fashion, that the more of something that you have on the market, the less you can demand for it because it's in abundance and it drives the prices down. So the theory goes, if we had more housing than we had people looking for housing, the price would go down. And that's, all things being equal, that's probably true. But there's a lot of snags in this. One of them is that in many cases, and I think Pasadena is one of those cases, the same people who will make this argument will also block the production of new affordable housing. So it's kind of trying to have it both ways kind of thing. The other thing I often say to this, respond to this, is to say that, Jill will know better about this. How long does it take for a new apartment building to go from, the approval process to occupancy?
Gosh, it could take
Roughly.
anywhere from, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on so many factors.
Yeah, between 2 and 5 years, and there are so many factors. And if we needed, let's say, what is our regional needs assessment in Pasadena is something like 6,000 affordable units at various different levels of affordability. How long is it going to take us to get that all occupied by the people that need it? And we need to do that. We need to not avoid that. But in the meanwhile, people are experiencing really great economic pressure in their life. So this is, the Measure H campaign is not opposed to more affordable housing, of course. either by adaptive reuse or new construction, but it doesn't mitigate the need for rent control in the housing that we already have. We can do both. We can be, advocates for both and actually campaign for both. The goal of these are different. New housing, the obvious goal of new housing is to make sure that there's enough for everyone to go around and that there isn't this scarcity. Rent control keeps people that are already housed securely housed, so that the pressures of the market don't drive them out of their homes and away from the community that is their home. Let me go to myth number 2, which is rent control will slow new housing starts. This isn't as common anymore, but we heard it from the Arroyo Democratic Club and ACT. We heard it from council members when they were considering whether to support or oppose Measure H. And we hear it from, it's the reason that we didn't get the endorsement of the building trades, for example, when we got like a host of other labor endorsements, we didn't get the building trades or the carpenters because they still have the belief that rent control will slow down the development of new housing. And if you think about it in a general sense, you could understand why, right? Like, if a new developer could pick between a city that has rent control and a city that doesn't, it makes sense that maybe they would choose the city that doesn't because they can charge whatever they want for rent. However, California has something called the Costa-Hawkins Act, which prevents any local rent control measure from applying to units built after February of 1995. So all new units, everything built after 1995, are exempt from rent control as long as Costa-Hawkins is in place. Tenant advocates and allies have tried for a number of years to repeal Costa-Hawkins. And if that were the case, we might have to contend with some different dynamics. But even from other states and other cities, we've seen that there really is no evidence that rent control chills housing supply. You may have followed the news of St. Paul that in 2020 passed a historic rent control measure and just cause. And they, because they don't have Costa-Hawkins or anything like it, they were able to get not only rent control, but rent control in all units, regardless of their age, so new construction as well. And they also got vacancy control. And we'll talk a little bit more about vacancy control in a minute. But vacancy control is where the rent cannot go up between tenants when one lease ends and another lease begins. And immediately, real estate developers halted their building projects mid-construction. People that had pulled permits stopped the process of, seeking approvals and entitlements to build their buildings. And the news media jumped on it and said, rent control kills, housing development in St. Paul. And some of us referred to that as a capital strike, which is where, capital doesn't like what's going on and they rebel by pulling resources out of a community. And now there was a report that came out a few weeks ago that shows that permits have rebounded in St. Paul, and developers are once again pulling the same number of permits for projects that they did before they temporarily stopped doing it. So it was kind of a protest on their part. And there is scant evidence that rent control slows new housing starts. Number 3 in my list is that rent control will destroy the quality of life of existing housing, the quality of existing housing. So sometimes people will say things when you'll hear people refer to New York City. Whoops, sorry about that. New York City, or you'll hear people talk about San Francisco in very negative terms, like rent control has destroyed these cities. And the argument goes that if landlords can't charge whatever they want, they will allow the apartments to deteriorate to a point where they're uninhabitable. So a few things on this. In many neighborhoods, and even in Pasadena, the quality of the housing is already very poor to dangerous. We see all the time apartment units that have been flooded by, and accidents happen, right? Pipes break. But then after that water damage, it hasn't been properly cleaned and there's mold growing in the apartment. The carpet, notoriously holds moisture and mold, and drywall the same way. So we see a lot of mold. We see rodents, everything from rats to, cockroaches and so forth, bed bugs, windows that don't close, doors that don't properly securely lock. There's a lot of uninhabitable conditions that we encounter on a normal basis in Pasadena. So landlords already aren't maintaining the quality of their buildings without rent control. The second thing to mention here is that landlord-tenant contract requires the landlord to maintain safe and habitable dwellings for their tenants. And state law is very specific about what makes for habitability. So I mentioned a minute ago, windows that close. This is a requirement by state law. If there's broken windows, those have to be fixed. If the front door doesn't lock, that's obviously a huge problem, and that's not legal to maintain a unit that doesn't have a locking door. If there's not heat, if there's not adequate running water, if the toilet doesn't work, these things seem obvious, right? Like if the toilet doesn't work, what are you going to do? But people like I'm working with a tenant recently who's had no kitchen for 6 months. There was a flood upstairs. It flooded her kitchen. It really destroyed a lot of things. They put caution tape around it. They sealed it off with plastic tarp, and she hasn't been able to access her kitchen for months. And this is Bevan and Brock. This is one of the biggest real estate management companies in the city of Pasadena. So whether there's rent control or not, state law mandates that landlords maintain their property. This is the job. This is like, having a job as a lawyer and then saying, I don't really like talking to clients. Like, this is what you do. And then finally, the rent board that Measure H will establish will be empowered to enforce habitability standards. Tenants can appeal to the board for a downward reduction adjustment in rent if habitability standards are not maintained. So that will be an additional incentive for landlords to maintain their buildings. The next one that I want to talk about is the idea that rent control unfairly benefits incumbents. I don't know if you've heard this one, but that rent control only benefits existing tenants. And sadly, that part is true. We'll talk about vacancy control in just a moment, but the whole point of rent control is to provide housing stability for existing tenants. And the reason it benefits only existing tenants and not future tenants is because of vacancy decontrol. So we talked about Costa-Hawkins a moment ago. The same Costa-Hawkins Act prevents local measures that establish vacancy control. So we couldn't enact vacancy control here in Pasadena, even if we wanted to, because of Costa-Hawkins. So that means that whenever the apartment becomes vacant, when a tenant moves out, and the landlord can readjust the rent to anything they want in between tenancies. So, the argument goes, like, the longer people stay, the more they benefit from their rent control, but newcomers to the city will have to pay market rate rents. And this is not a myth per se, in the sense that that is the case, but this isn't a reason to reject rent control. Vacancy control is mandated by the state level. There's nothing we can do about it. We would very much like to repeal Costa-Hawkins. But the answer to rising rents between tenancies is not rejecting rent control. It's eliminating vacancy decontrol, which allows rents to go skyrocket in between tenancies. You'll also hear, as sort of a corollary to this rent control unfairly benefits incumbents, people will say, a tenant, was worthy, I suppose, of lower rents. They benefited from rent control, but now they make more money. They got a better job. They got a raise, what have you. Maybe they got married and now they have 2 income earners in the family. And now they don't need rent control so much. They're actually paying way less than what they could afford to pay, and they just stay there and benefit from that rent control. And this is presented as a negative. And I just simply say, that's wonderful. That's great that people aren't paying their last penny for rent. But some will say, like, that's unfair, that they're benefiting from this long-term tenancy. But I like to remind people that homeowners also benefit from long-term residency. The dramatic increase in their property values is an unearned benefit, you might say. And homeowners who stay put for 20, 30, 40 years, this is celebrated as a good thing. But a tenant with below market rate who stays put is presented as a problem. And this is in part politically motivated. It's a way to keep poor people moving, or middle-class people moving along through the city, and not to put down roots. Everyone loves families that put down roots unless they are tenants. And then the motivation is for them to be able to move and go somewhere else, or buy a house one day, which would be a great thing if houses weren't about 14 times the average annual salary.
That's fantastic. I've never thought about that, Ryan, the way you just put it. I always just get defensive and go, well, maybe they'll buy a house and they'll leave. You're right. Why should only homeowners put down roots? Thank you.
Who is this? Is this Denise?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
It just blew me away that I never thought of this the way you're saying it.
Yeah. And I've had people say to me, it's this unfairness, but nobody thinks it's unfair for a homeowner to have their property values go up. Like, nobody would frame that as unfairness. And so I think just it goes back to a very old line in politics about the deserving poor or the undeserving poor. This idea that there are some lower income people who are more deserving than others. And this is a real trope that we need to fight. Let me, I see a hand. Colin, do you want to ask a question here?
No, I just wanted to add to that
Oh, yeah.
I lived in a rent control apartment in East Hollywood for 15 years. And as you can imagine, by the time I moved out, my rent was very low in comparison to what the market was for that same neighborhood.
Yeah.
But having that rent control, honestly, made it possible for me to save money so that my wife and I could buy the house we live in now.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
and that is the goal, right? Remember back, several decades ago, the idea was that, the American dream was that somebody would graduate from college, get a job, maybe get married, maybe have kids if that was what they chose to do. But within a few years' time, they would buy a house. And by doing so, they would free up that apartment for somebody else coming along through the pipeline. Well, now folks can't afford to buy houses the way that they used. Some of us are able to. I've never been able to. And that means that I'm occupying an apartment that decades before might have only been occupied for 3 or 4 years as someone saved up for an apartment, for a house. Colin, you're saying, saving up meant like 15 years instead of 3 or 4 years. But the housing market is not in line with the rest of the economy, and grows at a ridiculous rate and gets these bubbles, and then those bubbles burst, as most of us remember. Let me move on to the myth number 5, which is a corollary of myth number 4, that rent control reduces tenant mobility, that tenants won't be able to move because it'll be like the golden handcuffs, right, of low rent. But as I mentioned, tenants should be able to stay put and put down roots if they want to, like homeowners. There's nothing wrong. Maybe a family decides that they want to rent, and it's not that every family necessarily wants to own a home. Maybe they want to rent and save money for retirement a different way. And that should be a fair option. Some people are differently abled and not able to maintain a house on their own, with their own, just them and their partner, or them by themselves. Not everybody can handle like the responsibility and the work of maintaining a house, and may choose to be tenants. And vacancy control, vacancy decontrol, this is a typo, is mandated at the state level by Costa-Hawkins, as I mentioned before. But the answer again to rising rents between tenancies is not rejecting rent control, it's eliminating vacancy decontrol. Myth number 6, that Measure H, and now we're getting into some of the good stuff from the mailers that you've probably seen, that rent control will cost the city millions of dollars. So you may have seen this in your mail. Down in the blue section, our opponents, who are the California Apartment Association and the California Association of Realtors, and more specifically the Pasadena Foothill Association of Realtors, say that Measure H will cost Pasadena millions, that Measure H will cost up to $6 million to implement, draining local revenues away from fire protection, parks, and other essential services. And this is fake news. This measure will not cost Pasadena any money, $0. The money that will be required to implement the rent board and the registry and all the features of the program will come from a per unit fee to charged to landlords. And the independent analysis that they refer to up here, this independent review, said that it would be around $184 per unit per year. So if you're a mom and pop landlord and you have an ADU, or you have a house that you used to live in perhaps, and you decided, you know what, instead of sell it, let's just keep it and we'll rent it out. Maybe you have a family member that lives in it, or maybe you rent it to strangers, doesn't matter. If it's in Pasadena, you would pay around $184 a year, which is about the cost of a Netflix subscription. If you're a corporate landlord and you have hundreds and hundreds of units, of course, you're going to pay thousands of dollars in fees, which is exactly the way the measure is intended to work. If this is like a licensing fee for a restaurant or any other kind of business licensing fee that's assessed to, in the case of restaurants or other businesses, this fee usually goes to a state agency that's charged with the task of policing essentially compliance on business and food and health safety issues. That, we don't have health safety inspectors, don't do that for free. So there's various fees and taxes that restaurant owners pay to cover the charge of that. And very similarly in this case, and this is proposed to operate very much like other rent boards around the state of California, including Berkeley and Mountain View, and similar to Santa Monica as well.
So can you speak to the no oversight? Because
yeah, we're going to come, that's my next one.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I think I've said everything here. This is costing the city millions of dollars. It's costing the city $0. Please tell your friends. This is not going to cost it. It's not a tax. In another different flyer, the flyer they sent a week ago, it talked about, or their website talks about, taxpayers are going to pay millions of dollars. Well, that's only true if you say landlords are also taxpayers. Of course, landlords are taxpayers. So in that sense, taxpayers are paying for this, but not, the implication when they say that is that all taxpayers in the city will pay more, which is not true. And then finally, the 7th one here, before we go on to some of those that you've suggested, is that the rent board has no oversight. So this takes a little bit more
we can't
nuance.
see the 7th. We can't see the 7th. Your 7th.
Oh, really? Shoot.
There, now we can.
Oh, really? Is it?
But now we can.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Oh, is it good now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It was somehow the slides on my end were lagging on your end. So the first thing to say about accountability, because they say in these flyers that it's unaccountable to anyone. The reason this whole thing is happening, the reason we have a rent control campaign, the reason we have a Measure H, is that landlords have proven themselves by and large unaccountable. Now, of course, there are many landlords, including my landlord, who are quite accountable. She raises the rent on us every year. It's somewhere in the range of 5%. It's not great. I don't get a 5% raise at my job every year. So that means I'm going backwards. My wife and I, every year the rent goes up, I go a little bit backwards. in my financial stability, but it's not at least 10% or something like that. And she handles her business pretty well, maintaining the property. But many, many landlords, including the hundreds that were part of these fake rent evictions that we just heard about from Diowanni, these were big corporate landlords. They were trying to evict over 100 units, and who knows how many souls live in 100 units, maybe close to 200, right? If people don't live alone, some people do, some people have families. So maybe it averages out to a couple of hundred people were facing eviction for no fault. So landlords have demonstrated again and again that they willfully break the law. There's no enforcement. The city of Pasadena housing department doesn't enforce tenant law. The city attorney has, and I think this is correct. The city attorney doesn't work for us as tenants. The city attorney works for the city. So some tenants mistakenly think that the city attorney is going to defend them against their landlord. It's not going to happen. And there is no enforcement of tenant harassment, of habitability. Even code enforcement is supposed to inspect every apartment every 4 years. They don't do that. I've lived longer than 4 years in multiple apartments in Pasadena, and there's never been an inspection, a routine inspection. And even where we report code violations, we've seen many times where the code inspector comes out and writes a report, and maybe they say something's wrong, maybe they don't. In one case, there was visible dead rats in this woman's front patio, and the inspector said that there was no problem. So there just isn't accountability, either from the landlords or from the city. And so this is an attempt to deflect accountability onto this rent board, when the real question of accountability belongs with landlords. Secondly, the rent board is accountable. First of all, it's appointed by city council. So the city council members will appoint 7 tenants, 1 from each council district, and 4 at large from wherever in Pasadena. And they can be landlords, they can be homeowners, they can be tenants. Probably they won't be, because we already have the 7. So there's a diversity of viewpoints representing all 7 districts in the city. And the city council members will have the freedom to appoint those people. And they are also subject to term limits. And finally, the rent board's accountable to the people of Pasadena. If they don't act fairly and obey the law, lawsuits can be filed against the board. So the way they make it sound is that we have absolute impunity, like a foreign ambassador who has like diplomatic immunity or something like that. Like nothing can ever happen to stop the rent board from doing something wrong, illegal. Of course, the law will always be there as a recourse for someone that feels that the rent board has overstepped. So this idea that they're unaccountable, what they're saying is that it does not operate within the city manager system of our government in Pasadena. The rent board will not be subject to the control of the city manager, which, if you recall, was what the police accountability folks were arguing for the Police Oversight Commission. Because as it is now, and I sit on a city commission, I'm sure many of you have sat on city commissions or maybe currently do. At the Northwest Commission, where I serve, we're frequently told by the city attorney and the city manager that we're not even allowed to agendize a topic that they don't feel is relevant to our work area. And even if we say, well, you know, the Northwest Commission is kind of special in the sense that its work area is really anything that happens in the Northwest. But they don't really want us talking about policing issues, especially now that there's a Police Oversight Commission. But before that, it was very difficult to agendize police issues other than to get a simple report from the police sergeant that would come and give their regular reports. And so this new arm of the government, this new department will, and they said this in the city council meeting, we will have to work out lines of communication. Obviously, we can't, as I said before, just flout the law. And it will be in close dialogue with the housing department, close conversation with code enforcement. I don't think the rent board intends to actually hire code enforcers, code inspectors. That will still be code planning department. So there's a lot of integrations that will be required to build out this new city department, but we will have relative autonomy from the city manager, which is the only way we can ensure real accountability for the tenants that we represent. I keep saying we, I'm hoping I get appointed to the rent board, but who knows, I may not. That'll be up to my council member. And ultimately, if the rent board runs amok and does crazy things, there is a recall measure in the, there's a section in the code, in the Measure H, that will allow for a recall. Also, to be appointed to the rent board, you need to gather 25 signatures from people that you know that vote, that are voters in Pasadena, the same that any city council member would have to do. So there are multiple ways that the rent board is accountable to the people of Pasadena, to tenants, and to the city itself. But our opponents simply say that because it's not under the city manager, it's not accountable. So this is what the flyer says, one of the flyers, the most recent one. The city council will have no say. This is simply a lie. They also say that the residents of Pasadena will have no say, which is also a lie, because the residents of Pasadena always have a say. I see lots of you at city council meetings every single week that there is a city council meeting, having your say, and you may not get heard, but we try to have our say. And the same will be true. All of the meetings of the rent board will be public. I'm sure they will be Brown Act meetings that will be recorded for public records. The proceedings of those meetings will conform to all local government standards. So these are just lies, and there's no accountability really in the state of California to enforce the fact that they're just lying to voters. There's no truth in advertising and accountability for this. You could appeal to the state attorney general, but by the time they got around to even reading your email, the election would be over, and c'est la vie. So let me just pause there. I think that's the end of my presentation. And see if there are any questions, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the other myths that you brought up, or at least potential myths. I don't know how much time I have left, Bert, but I'm a former preacher.
We're at
so.
8 o'clock, so we have a little bit of time. Sonia has a question.
Yeah, Ryan, on this rent board, so people can come in like pro per, right? And without attorneys or anything. I've always been confused about the Housing Rights Center. Does that have anything to do with this? I mean,
so the Housing Rights Center is an independent nonprofit agency that works on housing issues, right? I've had a range of different experiences with them, good and sort of not so good. But they don't recognize the tenants union, for one thing. So we get tenants that come to us, they've talked to the Housing Rights Center, and we were like, well, that's not exactly the case. Or strategically, they're not going to advise a tenant to fight their landlord. And the city pays a good chunk of the cost of having the Housing Rights Center. So I'm always a little leery that the advice is a little skewed in the favor of the city. I don't have any hard evidence of that, but and we try to maintain good working relationships. Sometimes we'll get CC'd into the Housing Rights Center email correspondence with a tenant, and we try to navigate that gracefully. But that doesn't have anything to do with this. How exactly the rental board will work will have to be sorted out in implementation. But essentially, a tenant could come to the rental board, and say, You know, I have this documentation that my landlord's harassing me and he refuses to fix the leak in my roof that's making mold in my apartment, and I have all this evidence. Code enforcement's gone out there and the landlord still refuses. The rental board would have the ability to say, okay, we're reducing your rent to such and such until the landlord fixes this problem. The rent board could also hire attorneys. There'll be staff attorney, at least one staff attorney, probably working with the rent board and to represent tenants in cases where they have a serious. But hopefully most of that can be resolved in mediation, which the rent board can also facilitate.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So Jill has a question, or Anthony, one of them.
Yeah, I was wondering, Ryan, I think that there's some newer research that's come out of, I think it's Stanford, I'm not sure, that has debunked some of the older research because their basic assumptions were wrong. So what, can you speak to some of the research and where you're able to substantiate a lot of what you're saying?
Yeah, so I think I should have had this more at my fingertips. There's a great study out of USC. Let me see if I can Google it really fast. My computer was stolen recently and all my bookmarks went away. So all these great resources I had bookmarked for years. I should have been syncing my bookmarks, but somehow I didn't. Anyways, rent control policy. Let's see if this should pull it up. So what often happens in like the one Stanford study that you're talking about, and that this can partially address what someone also mentioned, I think, that people will say it doesn't work. And I think what the very next question when I hear rent control doesn't work, I always ask, work for what? Because it's like saying this, you know, this blouse is 10%. You would immediately ask, 10% of what? Like 10% of its original price, 10% of the sale, like 10% doesn't tell you anything. So to say something works or doesn't work, it doesn't really tell you anything unless you know that you're talking about the same goal. And often what will happen is they'll say rent control does not work to create broad-based housing affordability across the market. And to which most of us would reply, yes, that's true. We understand that. Especially, but it also depends on what kind of rent control, right? Like we talked about vacancy control and stuff like that. So what the Stanford study found was that rent control in San Francisco created housing stability for tenants and enabled them to stay put during volatile seasons in the market, which is what it's meant to do. But what they also said was that it didn't bring down rent prices broadly in the market where units are not subject to rent control, and where vacancies were allowed to, where the rents reset during a vacancy. I'm trying to find this. There's a really great sort of meta study. It's like almost like a lit review. What's the name of that thing? If someone wants to raise another question or two, I'm trying to think where I stashed all these.
Anthony, did you have a question? Yeah.
Oh, here's a great one. This is a great article by an economist. I see his name popping up more and more. Yeah, that's a good one from Shelter Force. Some of these are. Here's a paper by Tenants Together that came out after the Stanford study. So if you link on this most recent one here, Tenants Together, you'll get a link to the paper that Tenants Together wrote, but you'll also see a link to the Stanford paper. So you could read that one first and then read what Tenants Together had to say about it. Let me just try to find this rent control USC paper.
So
Yes.
Denise, do you have a question?
I had a question or a comment I wanted to make.
Okay.
So Ryan, I wanted to talk to you about or ask you about eviction. I know
Mhm.
that under the current system, if a landlord wants to evict a tenant, tenants usually don't have the resources to hire a lawyer. So 95% of the time they lose. Whereas if they have a lawyer, 95% of the time they don't get evicted in the courts. But how does this rent control board help tenants when they're facing eviction?
So it's not, you may have heard of right to counsel. There's a campaign in LA County broadly for right to counsel, which would mean that tenants would be entitled to an attorney. And the way that that would be accomplished is that the county would fund pro bono attorneys to represent tenants. It's a similar thing to like a public defender type of concept. Right now, something like 7 or 8% of tenants have a lawyer when they go to court, when they go to eviction court. So this is not creating or funding right to counsel. But there was an action by the Board of Supervisors today to continue sort of to explore an ordinance that would come in a couple of weeks after staff has a chance to write it, that would extend the Stay Housed LA program post-pandemic and sort of inch us a little bit closer to true right to counsel in the county. So if you are facing an eviction currently, there is a program called Stay Housed LA, and you can go to Stay Housed LA and get help there. stayhousedla.org. But that needs to be expanded because those lawyers are completely overwhelmed with cases. And so the goal is to fully fund right to counsel. What we found was that during the pandemic, of course, because of eviction protections, the number of eviction cases in court went way down. And during Rule 1, if you remember, there was a time we referred to it as Rule 1 because the Judicial Council passed Rule 1, which was that eviction cases would not proceed through the court. So during most of the pandemic, landlords would file an eviction case and a tenant had a defense. That's all. It wasn't that the eviction would not proceed. It's that when it did proceed and it went to court, a tenant could assert their defense under COVID law. During Rule 1, the court said no cases will proceed through the court, through the eviction courts. It stopped. And during that phase, we basically saw no evictions, of course, a few, because there was always an exception for like public safety. So if somebody's cooking meth in the apartment next door and endangering, the neighbors, that's always going to be a justifiable eviction, even under these emergencies. Now we're seeing evictions are back to pre-pandemic levels and going even a little bit higher now that rent debt is coming due for folks that couldn't pay their debt during the pandemic.
Will rent control help with the eviction? I mean, is there like a no fault eviction?
Yeah,
clause
so
in
in Measure H, there's a whole section that's no fault. I mean, sometimes we say there's 4 parts to the measure. There's really 2 like really meaty parts to the measure. One is rent control, the other is eviction protections. So it would not allow landlords to evict unless there's a reason given for that eviction. There will always be some, you have to follow the language here, it even trips me up to even say it right. There will always be some no fault just causes for eviction. For example, if a landlord has a house that they rent or even an apartment, the landlord will always be able to move themselves or their immediate family into that unit with 60 days notice. So, son graduates from college, comes back home, and dad says, okay, we're going to give this person 60 days notice so my son can move into that unit. That's a just cause that's not the tenant's fault. In that case, there would be relocation expenses provided, required for that tenant. Also, the renovictions that we talked about earlier. A renoviction is just a mashup of the word renovation, eviction, where the landlord says, I'm going to do major renovations, and that's a just cause for eviction currently. What this would do is our measure would require, again, relocation expenses, or the landlord would be required to say, I'm going to take this person or this family and relocate them to a vacant unit while I renovate this unit. They could do that as well. And then the tenant, but the real kicker, which I love about Measure H, is that the tenant would have the first right of refusal to come back to that unit that they lived in previously at the same rent that they were paying before. What we see a lot of times, the worst renovictions are the ones where the landlord evicts people on the pretense of an eviction, but they're not required to even pull permits before they do the evictions. And then folks are out, and sometimes the landlord is basically just kidding. I'm not going to do any renovations. Actually, I'm just going to rent this again to somebody for more money. So those are the major provisions. The other just cause, what's the other just cause? Taking the unit off the market. So this is a dicey one. This is the other. Did someone mention this earlier, that sometimes another criticism of rent control is that landlords will simply sell their buildings to corporate landlords, which is arguably worse. Sometimes not, but I would say on the whole, corporate landlords are worse actors than mom and pops, but for different reasons. Usually when mom and pops break the law, it's usually because they're just not that familiar, or they're not paying that close attention to all the complex law. And it is, believe me, very complex. When corporate landlords break the law, they're doing it deliberately with, malice aforethought, we might say. And the other way is the Ellis Act. Not to thoroughly confuse you, but there's another state law called the Ellis Act that allows landlords to take rent-controlled units off the market, so they could demolish them to put up something different, like a office tower or something like that, or office buildings, or they could simply actually take them off the market and keep them vacant. That's what the Ellis Act allows, if you can believe that. In the middle of a housing crisis, we have a law that allows landlords to just do that. So those things we still have to fight. We can't fix everything.
Denise, you had your hand up earlier. Did you get your question in?
No, not yet. And thank you again for this. I'm going to be going take care of my little one, get him to bed. But I wanted to ask really quick, is the whole point of the Costa-Hawkins being, is the reason they say new buildings are not subject to rent control, is that about the fact that they might still have a mortgage on them, and that you don't want to hamper them in case they have a huge mortgage?
Yeah, there's a lot of expenses, of course, associated with a building, and usually a developer ends up with multiple debts, that they have to pay off. And so they want
maybe they could tweak it to say, once you've paid off the original mortgage.
Or even, the other interesting thing is that AB 1482, which if you can follow this, is not subject to Costa-Hawkins because it's a state law. Costa-Hawkins only regulates local rent control. Costa-Hawkins AB 1482 has a 15-year rolling window where new construction is exempt from rent control for 15 years, but then eventually matriculates into rent control. Whereas Costa-Hawkins has a hard line at 1995. Even that would be better. What they did in St. Paul was they said all new construction is covered by rent control, but the landlord can set the starting rent. And there's also vacancy control. So in St. Paul, it would be very important for a developer to get the best rent they could get on day one, because ever after that, it's going to be subject to rent control. But remember, And this goes back to another myth that's going to bankrupt landlords. Number one, all of these laws are keyed to the CPI. So ours is 75% of the CPI, the increase. Typically the CPI, let's just say for round numbers, for years, it's been hovering around 4%. That 75% of CPI would allow landlords to raise rent 3%. This is for a number of reasons. Number one, right now, the measure, the CPI, and apologies for explaining things that maybe you already understand well, but it wasn't so long ago that I didn't understand what the heck even is the CPI. It's a basket of goods, they say. So if you went shopping and you just bought a few things that are typical purchases for the American family and average that all together, how much has that basket of goods gone up in price in the last 12 months? Yes, it's the rate of inflation. That's the consumer price index. So also in the consumer price index is rent. In fact, right now, rent is accounting for around 30% of the total consumer price index. So as rents go up, CPI also goes up. So to account for the fact that rent is in the CPI, we said 75%. There are cities like Bell Gardens that have 50%. Also, Bell Gardens just recently passed 50% with a hard 4% cap. So no matter what, it would never go over 4%. Pasadena's Measure H does not have a hard upper cap. So right now, for example, rent CPI is around 8%. Rent increases would be around 6% allowable, which is not great, right? But it goes with the CPI because the assumption is that landlord expenses will also potentially go up as the rate of inflation goes up. So it tracks. The other really important thing is that the Constitution guarantees that the US government cannot, without a good cause and just compensation, take your property away. You can remember how angry the colonists were with the King of England. So they made sure that private property would be sacred in America. So it's called the Takings Clause in the Constitution. And courts over decades have ruled that rent control that is too stringent violates the Takings Clause of the Constitution. So all modern rent control have little trigger ordinances or trigger sections written in there that basically say if the landlord comes to the rent board or to some government agency and says, look, I can't make a fair return on my investment. It's not just expenses. Expenses is one thing, but the landlord is also entitled to make a profit of a certain amount, which is called fair return. And there's a formula for it, and it's in the measure. If you read the measure, you'll see it. If you understand it on the first try, you get a cookie. But basically, the landlord can come to the rent board and say, I had to put on a new roof, the plumbing failed, these trees grew through the roots grew through my plumbing, and something else happened. I had to do all this construction. I need to raise the rents because I can't cover all that work that I just did. They will be allowed an upward adjustment in rent to cover that. And that's available to any landlord. What they won't be able to do is just simply claim that their expenses have gone up and therefore deserve to raise the rents. They will have to demonstrate that the expenses have gone up and therefore need to raise the rent.
This is great. So helpful.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
Let's take one more question. Don has a question. Let's take one more question, and then Jill is going to do her ED report.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, mine is kind of a two-parter, but okay. So right now, this is up for voting, right? This has nothing. City Council cannot veto this. City Council has nothing to do with this measure. If it's voted for and approved, City Council cannot stop it, right?
That's correct. It'll be a charter amendment, which means it will change the city charter like a constitutional amendment. What the City Council could do, or a citizen group could do, is put another measure on a future ballot to change it. But that's the only way it could be changed.
Okay. I don't know. Well, in that case, it doesn't really matter which way the wind's blowing with the city council, whether they're for this or against it. So it doesn't even matter. We want this to be voted on and approved, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And the city council had an opportunity under state election law. This when a citizen measure is placed on the ballot, the government agency, in this case, the city council, can decide, are they going to take a position against it, a position for it, or neither of those, and just remain neutral. You know, obviously our pleasure would have been, you know, for the city council to support us, but we didn't expect that, just long past experience. And so our best hope was that they would remain neutral and not actively fight us, which they could have done. They could have brought the resources of the city of Pasadena to fight this measure, but they did choose to remain neutral, which we are grateful for. And we feel that that's the most appropriate thing, since 15,000 Pasadena voters placed this on the ballot. A few council members, including Jess Rivas and I think Andy Wilson, said, you know, let's leave it to the voters to decide and not get involved. But individual council members on their own time may or may not do campaign work against the measure if they choose to.
Okay. And now real quick, and I don't know if this is the forum for this to get this response. Okay, the lady, I can't see her name now and I can't pronounce it. The lady that spoke earlier that received an eviction notice.
Oh, yeah.
Is there okay, can you give me a quick, I guess, format process that happens when someone gets evicted? Okay.
Yeah,
She
this is
mentioned she
something,
got a 60-day notice.
right?
What is the actual, if I own a property right now and say I want to evict somebody that's renting from me, is there something I have to do?
Yes, and this would be a good presentation for a future event as well, but they have to give you notice. If the landlord has to give notice, and depending on what kind of an eviction it is, it determines how long that notice has to be.
Okay.
If it's failure to pay rent, the landlord only has to give the tenant 3 days notice to pay or quit, is the terminology, either pay or get out.
Okay.
And then after that 3-day notice, the landlord can file an unlawful detainer, which is basically saying this person is unlawfully possessing my property, in the court. The court will then send you a summons and complaint in the mail, kind of like a subpoena almost, that you have to respond to. If you don't respond to it, the court rules in favor of the landlord every time. And so a lot of tenants get freaked out. They don't have a lawyer, they can't afford it. And it's called a default judgment. And a lot of times tenants do get default judgments because they don't respond. In the case of Diowanni, it was a renovation eviction. The same would apply to an owner move-in. If an owner wanted to move into their unit, they would have to give 60 days notice.
Okay.
And then if the person refused and said, I'm just going to stay here, then you'd have to go through the eviction process in the courts.
Okay. Now, do you just kind of have a rough idea of how many evictions take place that do not go through this process? Is there landlords take shortcuts?
Yes, this is such a great question. And again, we don't have time to do it justice, but one of the biggest sources of evictions that don't get counted are what we call self-evictions, where the landlord says, you need to leave, you've got 30 days to get out. And the tenant just thinks, gosh, it's the landlord's property, I guess I have to get out.
Right.
Or they're just afraid to fight because maybe something worse could happen. I don't know what else could be worse, but or maybe the harassment is so bad that they just say, I've got to get out of here for my mental health. And those people just move on their own. And that's not technically an eviction, though we think of it as an eviction in the tenants union, and we just don't know have a way to count that. They also do illegal lockouts, and we at the tenants union also defend illegal lockouts. We've broken locks to get people back into their unit, cut chains off of doors. You know, you cannot as a landlord change the locks on your tenant. You can't do that. You have to use the court system to do that. But and this is where a lot of mom and pops get it wrong. We had a tenant who was renting a room from a landlord's single family home, and they lived together, right? And they changed the locks on the person's door. And, she went to court to get back into the room. But then really, do you want to live in the house with this person who's trying to throw you out? Like, that's an awkward place to be also. So yeah, the people do resort to these very unlawful mechanisms, and we can help tenants fight those, but it takes a little bit of intestinal fortitude to do that.
Okay.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah,
Great presentation. A lot of questions, and it sounds like we could do a whole eviction forum.
we should do that, especially as more evictions are going to be coming in the pipeline. Thanks
Yeah.
so much for having me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. This is like, we've put 5 years of work into this, and we have 6 weeks to go. So I'm on duty, as it were.
Well, Jill is going to close us out with her ED report. So take it away, Jill.
Thanks, and thank you so much, Ryan. That was excellent. It's amazing to me how the work that MHCH has been doing the word is getting around, really without our advertising. Surprisingly, Dr. Phil contacted me to be on his show. And then today I was invited to be on a podcast. We were invited to write a chapter in a book with folks all around the nation working on church property and re-envisioning that as churches struggle. And so it just makes me think, because I as a person of Christian faith, I love the Bible, and it says here in Ephesians chapter 3, it says, "Now all glory to God, who is able through his mighty power to work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think." So I didn't ask for any of these things, and none of us did, but it's happening. And so that's been encouraging, and I feel grateful for that. Who would have imagined our collaborative efforts to pass an ordinance recently to allow churches that are on commercial zones to be able to have housing on their property. And that's because of many people on this call and many others that have stood up and made a statement. Again, today, the Ramona site that Bert mentioned is finally, as of this afternoon, is finally past the concept review. And the final design review now is the only thing left before we can build those units. Not we, but the National Corps. And I really hand it to Anthony, because he's been so faithful, and many churches that showed up for prayer vigils to make that a reality. Many of you have gone by that corner of Fair Oaks and Orange Grove, and it's so encouraging to see they're doing something finally. And so, I just have a lot to be grateful for tonight, including each of you that have come. I do have one announcement that I want to mention, and I'm putting it in chat. And so if you're familiar with any churches that are interested in looking at their underutilized church land and ways to maybe help provide housing on those sites, please let us know. We're starting a cohort a week from this Thursday of churches to kind of begin walking through that path of what it's going to take. So again, thanks to everybody. It's been a blessing to be here with you. And I guess that's it. So
can I make one more ask?
Yes.
I forgot to do this.
Volunteers. We need volunteers. Yes.
Yeah, volunteers. If you go to our website, you can volunteer. We're walking every weekend, knocking on doors. We're phoning people during the week, if you'd rather do that. The other thing I was going to mention is that we have a few churches that have endorsed the measure, and that may not be your congregation's cup of tea, and it may not be within your power to see that happen. But if you can have your church endorse, as we have the Friends meeting on Orange Grove, we have All Saints, and we have Troop UU. And I'm going to write a press release about, and then we have the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, which represents lots of congregations, especially African-American congregations. And so we're going to have a press release talking about the faith community endorsements. If you'd like to be a part of that endorsement process, or if you can ask your clergy person, or if you are that clergy person, I would love to seek that endorsement, and we could even put a yard sign in your in front of your church. So let me know. That would
That's
be
right.
ideal.
Yeah, so I've put the link there for rent control. If you scroll to the bottom of that, it gives all kinds of ways you can volunteer. And so be sure and check that out. And I want to just close with this, that Diowanni, when Ryan's organized a press conference, like he's planning soon for the faith community, they've got many of those 100 votes that have been given illegal evictions together, and made a public event, you know, with a press conference. And that was the very next day that Diowanni got a letter from her landlord saying, we apologize, but we're going to rescind that 60-day notice. So public pressure works as we work together, and that's why we all need each of you here today to work together to make all this happen. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you, Ryan and Diowanni and all who came.